Wisconsin, 2008. A cold case finally solved. Danielle Marie Halvorsen, 28 years old, worked as a veterinary clinic receptionist in a quiet suburb outside Madison. Known for her kindness to animals and her shy smile at the front desk, Danielle vanished one autumn evening without a trace. Her car was found idling near a wooded trail, purse inside, headlights still on. From the start, investigators hit wall after wall. No witnesses, no motive, no leads. The case froze, buried under silence and grief. But nearly 15 years later, a DNA breakthrough unlocked the truth, and what police uncovered shocked the entire community. How was the killer missed for so long? Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Middleton, Wisconsin, a town that looked like a postcard, green lawns, picket fences, and neighbors who knew each other by name. It wasn't a place where people locked their doors at night, and certainly not a place where young women simply vanished. But before all of that, before the headlines and vigils, there was Danielle Marie Halvorsen. At 28, Danielle's life was grounded in simplicity. She worked as a full-time receptionist at Lakeside Veterinary Clinic, a modest but well-loved practice on the edge of town. Her days were spent scheduling appointments, comforting anxious pet owners, and sneaking extra treats to nervous dogs. Clients often described her as gentle, with a soft voice and a warm, understanding smile. She was the first face people saw when they walked in, and the one they remembered most. Danielle lived just off University Avenue in a small duplex she shared with her older sister, Clara. The two were close. Clara, a pharmacy tech, often joked that Danielle was the emotional support sibling, the quiet anchor in a loud world. They cooked dinner together most nights and watched crime documentaries over microwaved popcorn, neither imagining that one day, Danielle's life would mirror those very stories. Outside of work, Danielle led a quiet life. She wasn't one for bars or crowds. She preferred the steady hum of a bookstore or the solitude of a hiking trail. Her weekends were often spent volunteering at a local animal shelter or visiting her aging parents in Baraboo, just a short drive away. Those closest to her knew she was still mending. A quiet breakup earlier that year had hit her hard. 5 years together, no closure, just silence. It had left her questioning a lot. But slowly, steadily, she had begun to heal. Friends noticed the small signs of progress. She started smiling more at work. She joined a community book club. She even signed up for a pottery class at the local arts center. She was getting her spark back, Clara would later recall. I was starting to recognize my sister again. Danielle wasn't just liked, she was trusted. She house-sat for neighbors, watered plants for vacationing coworkers, and was the kind of person people felt safe around. That trust, that gentle presence made her disappearance all the more jarring. Wednesday, October 22, 2008, began like any other. Danielle woke early, fed her cat Muffin, and packed her usual lunch: turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a thermos of green tea. She left for work at 8 a.m. and sent Clara a quick text: "Don't forget we need milk." It was the last mundane message before everything changed. That night, Clara came home to find the lights still off. Muffin hadn't been fed. Danielle never missed feeding Muffin. Clara tried not to panic. Maybe Danielle had dinner plans she forgot to mention. Maybe she stayed late at the clinic. But when calls went unanswered and hours passed, a heavy dread set in. By midnight, Clara was dialing 911. What followed would unravel the fabric of a town unprepared for what was coming. Danielle Marie Halvorsen wasn't a woman who made enemies. She didn't take risks. She didn't lead a secret life. She was ordinary in the most beautiful, unassuming way. And that's what made her sudden disappearance so chilling. What happened the evening Danielle never came home? Wednesday, October 22, 2008 began like any other for Danielle Marie Halvorsen. The morning was crisp with the kind of autumn chill that turned leaves gold and red in Middleton, Wisconsin. She arrived at Lakeside Veterinary Clinic just before 8 a.m., her thermos of green tea in hand, smiling faintly at the clinic cat sunbathing in the front window. The day passed without incident. Appointments came and went. A couple brought in a Labrador for its annual shots. A child cried over a sick hamster, and Danielle calmly handled each visitor, typing notes, answering phones, and keeping things running smoothly. Staff later said she seemed tired, but not unusually so. Just another long Wednesday in a week like any other. At precisely 5:07 p.m., Danielle logged out of the front desk system. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by investigators, showed her locking the clinic's glass doors, glancing once over her shoulder, then heading to her car, a silver 2004 Toyota Corolla, parked just feet from the entrance. She waved at a departing co-worker, got into the driver's seat and pulled away. That was the last time anyone saw Danielle alive. When she didn't come home by 7:30 p.m., Clara began texting, then calling. Nothing. At first she thought maybe Danielle had stopped at the grocery store or taken a spontaneous walk. But when Muffin, her cat, hadn't been fed and Danielle still hadn't answered by 9 p.m., alarm bells rang. Clara began driving around town, retracing Danielle's usual routes, hoping to spot her car in a parking lot. Just before 10:30 p.m., a jogger called in a report of a suspicious vehicle parked awkwardly at the entrance to Eagle Crest Nature Preserve, a wooded area just outside town. The car's headlights were off, but the engine was idling softly. Deputies arrived minutes later. It was Danielle's Toyota. The driver's door was unlocked. Her handbag was on the passenger seat. Inside were her wallet, keys, and phone. On the screen, 5 missed calls and 2 unread text messages. Her jacket was missing and the seatbelt had been unfastened. The engine was still warm to the touch. It looked like she had just stepped out and never come back. Deputies radioed in a missing person report, and by midnight, search teams with dogs and thermal imaging equipment were combing the preserve. Flashlights swept through branches and brush as officers called her name into the silence. But there was no sound, no footprints, no broken twigs, no sign of a struggle. Nothing. The forest, dense and quiet, gave up no answers. Meanwhile, back at home, Clara paced the floor as friends and family arrived. Fear was now full-blown panic. Danielle didn't vanish. She didn't run off. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. She was careful, predictable. She called if she'd be late. She never went into wooded areas alone at night. By 3 a.m., officers knocked on Clara's door. They had found Danielle's car, but no Danielle. And that was the moment everything changed. Word spread fast. By dawn, Middleton, so used to calm routines, woke up to fear. How could someone disappear like that without a scream, a witness, or a clue? How could such a tight-knit town feel so suddenly unsafe? Overnight, the ordinary had become unthinkable. And as daylight broke over the trees of Eagle Crest Preserve, search crews prepared for a second, more exhaustive sweep. What would police find, if anything, in the chilling scene left behind? On the morning of October 24, 2008, 2 full days after Danielle Halvorsen's disappearance, search teams gathered at the trailhead of Eagle Crest Nature Preserve for what was now being called a recovery mission. The optimism of those early hours had eroded into quiet dread. The town, still holding on to hope, was about to be dealt a devastating blow. It was just after 11 a.m. when a K-9 unit alerted near a patch of dense brush, about 60 yards off the main trail. Officers pushed their way through the thick undergrowth, the sharp snap of twigs underfoot cutting through the silence. What they found would haunt them for years to come. Danielle's body was partially concealed beneath a pile of sticks and fallen leaves, arranged deliberately to blend into the forest floor. Her limbs were positioned unnaturally. Her once white sneakers were smeared with soil. The first responding officer reported a single word into the radio. Located. The scene was quiet, almost reverent. As investigators cordoned off the area, an autopsy would later confirm what detectives already suspected. Danielle had been strangled. The hyoid bone in her neck was fractured, a clear sign of manual force. There were no stab wounds, no gunshot injuries. Her torn jacket was discovered nearly 10 feet away, snagged on a branch. There were no defensive wounds, no broken fingernails, no bruises consistent with a fight. It was as if she had been taken by surprise, or had known her killer. The brutality of the crime stunned the entire community. Local media immediately picked up the story. Middleton in mourning, read one headline. Who killed Danielle? Read another. Candlelight vigils were held in town parks where hundreds gathered, clutching photos and prayers. Her parents stood before cameras, trembling but resolute, pleading for answers. Her mother's voice broke as she said, "Someone knows what happened. Please, don't let this be the end of my daughter's story." Detectives began combing through the crime scene, but something felt off. It wasn't just the horror of the act. It was how little had been left behind. There were no footprints leading in or out of the brush. No tire marks, no discarded items, no signs of dragging or transport. The body had been placed, not dumped. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Forensic technicians swept the area meticulously. They collected soil, twigs, skin cells, anything that might offer a clue. But as results trickled in over the following days, they were met with disappointment. No DNA, no fingerprints, no hair or fiber that could be definitively tied to anyone. The forensic pathologist confirmed Danielle died within a few hours of leaving work. That meant someone had followed her or waited for her. The calculated placement of the body raised red flags. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. Police began to ask chilling questions. Was this the work of someone who had done this before? Someone trained in avoiding detection? Or worse, someone she trusted enough to let her guard down? The lack of defensive injuries suggested she hadn't fought back. That detail haunted detectives. And then there was the jacket, ripped, as if tugged from her during a sudden struggle or possibly used in the attack. Analysts hoped it would hold trace evidence, but early lab results came up empty. The scene was, in the words of one lead investigator, eerily sterile, too clean, too calculated. As Middleton mourned, investigators began facing a grim reality. This wasn't just a tragic loss. It was a calculated, cold-blooded murder, and whoever was responsible had left almost no trace behind. Why didn't the killer leave a trace? By the third day after Danielle Halvorsen's body was found, the Middleton Police Department officially declared her case a homicide. A dedicated task force was assembled, small by major city standards, but sizable for the quiet Wisconsin town. Officers from the county sheriff's office and state crime labs joined local detectives in the search for answers. Their first step was to cast a wide net. Within the first 2 weeks, over 60 individuals were questioned. Co-workers described Danielle as reserved, reliable, and without enemies. No one reported suspicious behavior or strange visitors in the days leading up to her disappearance. Her schedule was routine: work, home, occasional weekend visits to her parents. Friends emphasized that she didn't drink much, rarely dated after her last breakup, and wasn't the type to put herself in risky situations. Naturally, investigators turned their attention to the ex-boyfriend. They dated for nearly 5 years before an abrupt split 6 months earlier. But after reviewing phone records, emails, and GPS data from his vehicle, detectives verified his alibi. He had been out of state the night Danielle vanished. Next came registered sex offenders in the region. Detectives visited their homes, reviewed parole records, and checked for connections to the nature preserve. Again, no promising leads. Each tip seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. Meanwhile, forensics teams combed over Danielle's car and clothing for microscopic evidence: fibers, skin cells, anything that could link a suspect to the crime. Her torn jacket underwent advanced testing, but it too yielded nothing conclusive. Then came a maddening blow: the trail camera near the entrance of Eagle Crest Preserve, the one that should have recorded anyone coming or going, had been out of service that week. A power surge days before had fried the system, and the replacement unit hadn't been installed yet. The failure of the one surveillance point that could have captured the killer's movements was a devastating setback. By mid-November, the pressure from the public was intensifying. Local media outlets questioned the police department's preparedness. Town forums filled with speculation, frustration, and fear. Mothers no longer let daughters jog alone. Doors that had been left unlocked were now bolted. Middleton had lost its innocence. Behind closed doors, cracks began forming in the investigation. Miscommunications between departments led to duplicate interviews and overlooked timelines. One report detailing a suspicious vehicle seen near the preserve the night of Danielle's disappearance was misplaced for weeks. Evidence processing was delayed due to a backlog at the state lab. Some whispered that the Middleton police, so used to minor crimes, simply weren't equipped for a case like this. Detectives pushed back, insisting they were doing everything in their power. But internally, morale was slipping. Leads were drying up. Frustration turned to fatigue. And all the while, the Halvorsen family waited, attending press conferences, answering media questions, and watching the system struggle to deliver justice for their daughter. By the end of 2008, the investigation had begun to stall. Without a suspect, a motive, or a trace of forensic evidence, detectives were left with little more than theories. One internal memo summed up the situation in grim terms. "We're chasing shadows." And perhaps most unsettling of all, whoever had killed Danielle was still out there, living freely, possibly watching the investigation unfold, possibly blending into the very community that grieved her loss. The case was already beginning to slip from headlines, and investigators quietly began preparing for the worst outcome. Would the cracks in the investigation doom the case forever? By the start of 2010, the energy that once powered the investigation into Danielle Halvorsen's murder had all but disappeared. The Middleton Police Department, exhausted and out of leads, made the quiet but devastating decision to classify the case as cold. It was the official label no family ever wanted to hear, confirmation that no one was actively looking anymore. That justice for now was out of reach. The task force was dissolved. Files were boxed up, archived, evidence was stored, awaiting a day that may never come. Officers were reassigned, and life in Middleton for everyone but the Halvorsen family began to move on. For Danielle's parents, Judy and Gerald, time seemed to fold in on itself. Every October brought back memories and mourning. They held candlelight vigils in city parks and released lanterns into the night sky, hoping their daughter's name would echo loud enough to reach someone, somewhere, who knew the truth. But year after year, the silence only deepened. Clara Halvorsen, Danielle's older sister, refused to let the case disappear. In early 2011, she launched a website, justicefordanielle.org, detailing the timeline, the evidence, the heartbreak. She included photos from Danielle's childhood, footage from news coverage, and even her sister's voicemail greeting. Her goal was clear: keep the story alive. When media attention dwindled, Clara paid out of pocket for a series of billboards along major Wisconsin highways. The signs were simple. Who killed Danielle Halvorsen? Middleton, October 2008. Reward for tips. But the tips that came in were often vague, irrelevant, or from people seeking attention. Clara granted interviews to podcasts, true crime blogs, and even a national crime documentary program. But none of it brought answers. Her advocacy came at a cost. The emotional toll of constantly reliving Danielle's murder strained her relationships, her job, and even her mental health. Some friends quietly stepped back, unsure how to comfort someone so consumed by grief. But Clara pressed forward. The years blurred. Seasons changed, and Middleton, like many towns, slowly forgot. The trailhead where Danielle's car was found became just another parking lot. The wooded preserve was trimmed and repaved. New families moved in, unaware of the tragedy buried in local history. Even within law enforcement, turnover meant newer officers weren't familiar with the case unless they specifically sought it out. One former detective who had worked the file admitted in a rare interview, "It's the kind of case that haunts you, because it just stops. No ending, no closure, just silence." Danielle's memory, however, never faded from the hearts of her family. Her childhood room remained untouched in her parents' home, frozen in time with her books, her old stuffed animals, and photos taped to the mirror. Every holiday was marked by her absence. Every milestone, birthdays, anniversaries, became a wound reopened. And Clara never stopped asking the same question, one that grew sharper with each passing year. Who did this to my sister? By 2018, nearly a decade had passed with no movement. Technology had advanced. New forensic methods were emerging across the country. Cold cases in other states were being solved through DNA breakthroughs and genealogy databases. But Danielle's case remained untouched. Still, Clara held out hope. "It just takes one thing," she said in a television interview. One test, one person, one match. But in a case that had been frozen for years, what could possibly break the ice? What could possibly revive a case frozen in time? By late 2022, Danielle Halvorsen's case had collected more dust than leads. It had been 14 years since her body was found beneath a brush pile in Eagle Crest Nature Preserve. 14 years of birthdays missed, holidays hollowed, and questions unanswered. But behind the scenes, hope flickered again as part of Wisconsin's newly launched Cold Case Initiative, a state-funded push to re-examine unsolved homicides using advanced forensic tools. A rotation of forensic analysts began reviewing dormant case files. Danielle's case was one of the first selected. It was marked not just by community significance, but by the chilling lack of forensic evidence in a seemingly personal, calculated crime. Enter forensic analyst Jordan Meeks. a specialist in mitochondrial DNA extraction, tech that had become exponentially more powerful in the years since 2008. Meeks reviewed the original evidence, logs, and made a simple but critical decision to reprocess Danielle's torn jacket. The jacket, found several feet from her body, had been tested in the early days of the investigation but produced no viable DNA. The methods used at the time lacked the sensitivity to pick up the faintest biological traces. But in 2022, everything had changed. The lab technicians got to work. Using vacuum collection, chemical separation, and next-gen sequencing, they targeted areas around the collar and cuffs, places most likely to retain skin cells. Days later, they had something that hadn't existed in 2008, a partial male DNA profile. It wasn't enough for a direct match, but it was enough to enter into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, and GEDmatch, a public database used for familial tracing. The profile didn't ping any active criminals in CODIS. But in GEDmatch, a distant familial link popped up, a man living in Ohio, genetically related to the unknown DNA source. He was an older individual with no ties to Wisconsin. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the web of relatives connected to that DNA, what genealogists call genetic triangulation. Over the next several weeks, a forensic genealogist worked alongside investigators to build out a family tree from scratch. They pored over public records, social media, obituaries, military documents, and yearbooks. Piece by piece, they mapped generations backward, then forward, narrowing their focus to branches located in southern Wisconsin. One name rose to the top: Darren Kolecki, age 49. He lived in Portage, just 20 miles north of Middleton. He had no criminal record in Wisconsin, no prior contact with police, no previous connection to the Halvorsens. But there were some red flags. Kolecki had worked as a seasonal groundskeeper in Middleton in the mid-2000s. His work sometimes brought him into the Eagle Crest area. A quiet man, he had flown completely under the radar during the initial investigation. The discovery electrified the team. They had for the first time a living person possibly tied genetically to the evidence found on Danielle's clothing. Quietly, they began building a shadow profile. Surveillance was initiated. Trash pulls were conducted to obtain a discarded item for DNA comparison. Weeks later, the results came back: a match. The DNA from Kolecki's discarded coffee cup matched the partial profile recovered from Danielle's jacket. It was the breakthrough no one saw coming, the one Danielle's family had begged for. A sliver of science sharpened by time had pierced through 14 years of silence. Still, one question loomed larger than all the others. But would it lead to the real killer? On a gray, overcast morning in March 2024, nearly 16 years after Danielle Halvorsen's life was taken, two unmarked vehicles pulled quietly into a modest residential neighborhood in Portage, Wisconsin. The address belonged to Darren Kolecki, a 49-year-old man who, until now, had never been considered a person of interest. Within minutes, Kolecki opened his front door to the soft knock of state investigators and cold case detectives. What followed was the moment Danielle's family had waited more than a decade to see: an arrest. Kolecki, confused but compliant, was placed in handcuffs and transported to the State Crime Bureau for questioning. The DNA match from his discarded coffee cup had been enough to obtain a warrant. And now, face to face with the detectives who had revived Danielle's case, he would finally be confronted with the evidence against him. Inside the interrogation room, the mood was clinical, measured. Kolecki, wiry and soft-spoken, sat across from two lead investigators. When they told him he was being connected to a 2008 homicide, he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, arms crossed, and calmly denied ever knowing anyone named Danielle Halvorsen. But the walls around him were beginning to close in. Investigators laid out the timeline: his seasonal employment as a groundskeeper in Middleton during the fall of 2008, including maintenance shifts near the Eagle Crest Nature Preserve. Then came the cell tower records. His phone had pinged near the trailhead that very evening, October 22, 2008, during the window of Danielle's disappearance. Next, they introduced evidence from his sealed record in another state. In 1996, Kolecki had been arrested but not convicted for stalking a female coworker in Indiana. Due to procedural issues, the charges had never stuck. The file was buried, forgotten, until now. Confronted with these facts, Kolecki remained calm. He denied involvement, claimed he didn't remember being near the preserve that night. But as the questioning dragged into hours, cracks began to show. He contradicted himself on minor details. He seemed confused when asked about specific work assignments. And most damning of all, he had no explanation for how his DNA ended up on Danielle's jacket. That was the turning point. Later that evening, Koletsky was booked into the Dane County Jail on charges of first-degree intentional homicide. Bail was denied. The community of Middleton, upon hearing the news, was stunned. Local headlines lit up. Arrest made in 2008 cold case and DNA links Portage man to Halvorsen murder. For many residents, the name Darren Koletsky meant nothing. He was a ghost in their memories. But to law enforcement and the Halvorsen family, he represented a chilling answer to a question that had haunted them for years. People asked, how had he escaped suspicion for so long? The answer was buried in the chaos of the early investigation. Koletsky had no strong ties to Danielle, no known relationship. His name never appeared in interviews, and without DNA evidence back then, there was nothing to point investigators in his direction. Yet he had lived just 20 miles away all this time, shopping in nearby towns, working odd jobs, blending in. The arrest brought relief but not peace. The town still reeled from the realization that Danielle's killer had lived among them, that a predator had slipped through their fingers. For Clara Halvorsen, it was a moment of both vindication and heartbreak. I wanted to see justice, she said through tears, but I didn't expect it to feel this heavy. The case had finally cracked wide open. But this wasn't the end. How would the justice system handle a case 15 years in the making? On January 6, 2025, the long-awaited trial of Darren Koletsky began at the Dane County Courthouse. It had been over 16 years since Danielle Halvorsen's murder, but for her family, the grief felt as raw as the day she disappeared. The courtroom was packed with media, legal observers, and a quiet but persistent group of Middleton residents who had followed the case since its beginning. Opening statements from the prosecution laid the foundation for a case built on science, circumstance, and chilling behavioral patterns. They made it clear, Darren Koletsky may not have left fingerprints, but his DNA and his past told a damning story. The centerpiece of the trial was the DNA evidence recovered in 2022 from Danielle's torn jacket. A forensic analyst walked the jury through the decades-long evolution of genetic testing, explaining how what was once unusable became the key to solving a murder. They introduced the coffee cup DNA match and outlined the genealogical web that had led directly to Koletsky. Prosecutors then shifted to cell tower data. Danielle's phone had stopped transmitting near Eagle Crest Preserve at 6:14 p.m. on October 22, 2008. Koletsky's phone had pinged the same tower at 6:08 p.m. and again at 6:20 p.m., placing him at the scene during the critical time frame. But what shook the courtroom most was the behavioral evidence. The jury heard testimony about Koletsky's sealed 1996 stalking case from Indiana. Though never convicted, the details mirrored a pattern. Female victim, workplace connection, isolated area. A former co-worker from that case testified about how Koletsky had followed her home for weeks and once left an anonymous note on her windshield. The prosecution presented a theory. Koletsky, who had worked near Eagle Crest in 2008, had either seen Danielle at the clinic or watched her from a distance, forming a silent obsession. When opportunity met impulse, he acted. Throughout the trial, Danielle's family sat in silent anguish. Her mother clutched a rosary. Her father never looked at Koletsky. Clara, seated beside the victim advocate, cried quietly as a forensic expert reenacted Danielle's final moments using crime scene diagrams and mannequins. The defense tried to cast doubt. They argued the DNA evidence was circumstantial, just a partial profile. They reminded the jury there were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no confession. They claimed the evidence had degraded over time, and that there was no direct link between Koletsky and Danielle. But the jury was unconvinced. Closing arguments were delivered on January 20. The prosecution reminded the panel that silence is not innocence and that the absence of noise in 2008 didn't erase the weight of evidence in 2025. The defense reiterated reasonable doubt, but it fell flat against the emotional tide in the room. After just 6 hours of deliberation, The jury returned their verdict, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Kolecki sat motionless as the sentence was read. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion, no apology, no glance toward Danielle's family. Relief washed over the courtroom, but it was tempered by sorrow. Justice had come, but slowly, painfully, and with a price that could never be repaid. Outside the courthouse, Clara spoke briefly to reporters. Her voice cracked but remained firm. "This doesn't bring my sister back, but it tells the world she mattered. She was loved, and someone answered for what they did to her. The gavel had fallen and the system had done its part. But beyond the verdict, what will this case truly be remembered for?" In the months following the trial, the town of Middleton began to breathe again, cautiously, quietly, and with a deeper awareness of what justice truly meant. The conviction of Darren Kolecki had closed a brutal chapter, but the legacy of Danielle Halvorsen's case was only just beginning. Danielle's story, once a headline of heartbreak, became a rallying cry for hope, perseverance, and the importance of giving voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. In spring 2025, the Halvorsen family announced the creation of the Danielle M. Halvorsen Memorial Scholarship, designed to support students pursuing careers in veterinary science. It was a fitting tribute, one rooted in Danielle's love for animals and her quiet service to others. Each year, one student from Wisconsin would receive financial support to follow the path Danielle had once walked. The scholarship ceremony became more than just a remembrance. It became a symbol of what could grow from tragedy. But the impact reached far beyond the family. The case triggered a series of changes within law enforcement across the state. Inspired by the success of the Cold Case Initiative and the critical role forensic genealogy had played in identifying Kolecki, the Wisconsin Department of Justice allocated new funding for advanced DNA technology, including expanded access to familial matching databases and rapid DNA processing for old evidence. Middleton's own police department underwent internal reform. After years of criticism surrounding the early mishandling of Danielle's investigation, the department launched an internal review process of all open cold cases. A dedicated cold case unit was formed, and new protocols were established to ensure forensic evidence in older cases would be reevaluated using emerging techniques every 5 years. Danielle's name was now permanently linked to those reforms. Clara Halvorsen, once just the grieving sister in the background, had transformed into a powerful voice for victims' families. She became an outspoken advocate, traveling across the Midwest to speak at law enforcement conferences and victim support panels. In interviews, she emphasized the importance of persistence, not only from families, but from communities and systems that so often let cold cases drift into obscurity. "My sister was quiet in life," Clara said at a memorial vigil, "but in death her voice brought change. She made the system better, without ever raising hers." Danielle's picture, once a missing poster on a utility pole, was now featured in presentations on modern forensic triumphs. Her story was told in university lectures, true crime documentaries, and state seminars on criminal justice reform. She had become a case study, not in how to fail, but in how to never stop looking. Yet with all the progress came a lingering question. Danielle's story had a conclusion. Many others did not. Families across the country continued to wait. Some had waited even longer. In the final days of the trial, Clara spoke words that would echo far beyond Wisconsin. "We were lucky that science caught up with our story. But what about the stories no one reopens? What about the people still waiting for someone to care enough to look again?" It's a question that haunts those who work in cold case units. A question that underpins every unopened file, every untested sample, every name etched into silence. The legacy of Danielle Halvorsen isn't just the arrest, the conviction, or the scholarship. It's the renewed call to listen, to remember, to dig deeper, and to believe that every victim deserves a second chance at justice. What do we owe those whose stories go cold in silence? Danielle Marie Halvorsen was more than a name in a file or a face on a missing person flyer. She was a daughter who never missed Sunday visits, a sister who listened without judgment, and a gentle soul who brought comfort to anxious pet owners with nothing more than a soft smile. Her quiet presence made a difference in the lives around her. But for 15 long years, her voice was silenced by the unknown. The 2008 Wisconsin cold case that once baffled an entire town now stands as a powerful reminder of what persistence can achieve. Advances in DNA technology, the rise of forensic genealogy, and the sheer determination of her family, especially her sister Clara, broke through a wall that once seemed impenetrable. It wasn't luck. It was effort. It was science. It was love. Danielle's legacy doesn't end with a courtroom verdict. It lives on in the scholarship that bears her name, in the reforms she inspired within law enforcement, and in the families who now believe that their own cold cases might one day be reopened, re-examined, and resolved. Her case has taught us that justice may sleep, but it does not die. With time, care, and courage, it can be awakened. Let Danielle's story be more than a cautionary tale. Let it be a call to action, for justice, for reform, and for remembrance. If this story moved you, share it. Speak her name. Keep her light alive in conversations, in hearts, and in hope, because every victim deserves to be remembered. And justice, no matter how delayed, must always be pursued. Danielle Marie Halvorsen will not be forgotten.